Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Take Back the City Coalition event on the Status Quo is Not an Option, Building a Sustainable Belfast. My name is Rory Hearne. I'm an assistant professor in social policy at Maynooth University, and I'm absolutely delighted and privileged to chair the event today, and I really welcome you all to be part of it. Obviously, we're virtually together, and I look forward to sometime in the coming months where hopefully we will all be actually physically to be able to be together to be part of this journey. And I really thank you for taking the time out today to be part of this. Each one of you being here is very important to us. So I suppose today is a really important and exciting opportunity for us all to come together to consider the future of housing in Belfast and how we might together address some of the challenges that face us in ensuring that everyone has the right to adequate housing in Belfast. The housing crisis is one of the most fundamental challenges that we face across the island of Ireland. An affordable, decent standard, secure home is the most fundamental of all human needs. It is a human right, and governments have a fundamental responsibility to ensure that their citizens have a home. There is incredible potential in the Mackey site to address issues of housing need, of homelessness, and to build a new vision for inclusive, sustainable communities in Belfast. And as a coalition, we are particularly interested in making practical, sustainable suggestions for resolving the housing crisis. And our efforts are focused around a site in the west of the city, on this Mackey's weapon factory site, the old Mackey site, which has 25 acres. It's an incredible size of a site. And we believe that could be utilised to develop a new, innovative and visionary community-led housing model based on sustainable homes, building, planning and finance. Now we have a number of very important contributions, presentations being made today, and they include from housing activists affected by the crisis, Marissa McMahon from the Participation in the Practice of Rights, on her experience of campaigning for housing rights over the last 10 years. We also have Agustina Martire from Queen's University Belfast on the possibilities for addressing the housing crisis presented by public land. We're also delighted to have Minister Nicola Mallon, the Minister for Infrastructure, on the Department of Infrastructure's plans for a greenway funded on the Mackey site. We're also delighted to have with us Grainia, the Chief Executive of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, and Alistair, Reid, the Director of Place and Economy at Belfast City Council, and last but certainly not least, Hugh, Ellis, Policy Director with the Town and Country Planning Association. We have a broad representation of people attending and registered today, including elected representatives, officials, campaigners, community activists, citizens of Belfast, and international guests. And as I said at the outset, you're all very, very welcome today. We are particularly pleased to have representatives from the Northern Ireland Housing Executive and Belfast City Council here to present their visions for addressing homelessness, the housing crisis and the climate crisis in Belfast, and how they intend to fulfil their obligations into the future. The Minister for Communities, Deirdre Hargey, was also invited to partake today, but unfortunately was unable to attend due to diary commitments, and we look forward to continuing engagement with her and the others into the future. And the Take Back the City Coalition want to progress and continue engagement with these state bodies and the communities over this journey for the coming 6 months. Now, the time is tight this morning, and that's because we want to give a proper opportunity to hear from our presenters. But if you do have a question, and we encourage you to partake as well in the Q&A, you'd like to ask any of our speakers, you can put an entry into the Q&A section, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and please do put in comments and questions there. We are, after all, about participation at its heart of all of this, the participation. We also have attendees and participants today who are being recorded. We're recording the main speakers, but as a participant, you will not be visible on the recording. Now, just a few comments, I suppose, from my own experience and perspective and background and being involved in this. The housing, and when I've looked at this as a housing expert, the housing and homelessness crisis is not unique to Belfast. Indeed, it's across this island, but also it is global. And there's been a rise in recent years, as many of you will have seen and some experienced, a rise in homelessness, the emergence of what have been called generation rent, with people in their 20s and 30s and 40s locked into unaffordable and insecure private rental housing, increasingly being provided by so-called vulture and investor funds. We also have generations stuck at home, adults living at home in overcrowded situations. Excuse me. This is having huge societal impacts, particularly on families and particularly on mental health. I have described it as a social catastrophe, the impacts of housing, and there needs to be more focus on the human impact of this growing housing crisis. It stems from the failure of governments to build social and affordable housing on a sufficient scale, the turn to the private market, the conversion of land and housing into an investment rather than what it always should be, which is a home. Over 10 years ago, I first met the Participation, Practice and Rights Project. I came to Belfast and met them and the communities they were working with. I was working at the time as a community organiser and policy advisor in the social housing estate of Dolphin House in Dublin. And we were embarking on a human rights-based approach to addressing substandard housing conditions affecting tenants where I worked. What I learned in that frontline work is that without a secure, decent standard, affordable home, people cannot live in dignity. And that is why housing is a fundamental human right. It is set out in the United Nations covenants, which our governments have signed up to. And in that signing up, our government and each government has taken on a commitment and the responsibility to ensure that everyone has the most basic of rights and needs, a home, met. And through building new homes, we can and must address the other most pressing crisis, which is the environmental and climate one. And so the challenge we have set ourselves, all of us here today, and particularly the duty bearers, the state bodies responsible for housing and community, is how we can solve the homelessness and the wider housing crisis, along with contributing to addressing the climate and environmental crisis here in Belfast, through the use of the resources available to us, publicly owned land, our people, and their energy, creativity, and vision, and a state that wants to work and address this crisis. Marissa McMahon, who's going to speak later, said it was absolutely right when she said, we desperately need new thinking to tackle these crises. It is time for a new approach, a new vision, a new model for a new Belfast, for the population of the present and of the future. And I believe that this new model that we hopefully will develop together can be a new model for the rest of Ireland and for further afield too, the rest of this island. Today is the start of a process of outreach and engagement to statutory bodies and communities. We don't, as Hugh Ellis said, have to accept a bleak future. We can live happier, healthier, and more secure lives. We're going to hear now from some of the people who are affected by the housing crisis. Participation in the Practice of Rights have been asking people about their experiences in the course of the organising and campaigning work that they do to advocate for the right to housing.
We've been on a list for the transfer just for over 3 years. My son has severe autism, additional needs, behaviour issues. We're in a tiny 2-bedroom and he needs a wet room. OT have passed him to have a wet room only when we get a 3-bedroom house. It's just not acceptable. We need change.
I was homeless for a number of years before getting accommodation through PPR. It was a very stressful period in my life when I was homeless. So to imagine going back there has just been very depressing. I am pleading with you to help us out in some way because our contract is coming to an end in less than 3 months.
When I complain, they react very bad, and one time they close the phone in my face, I'm working and pay taxes, and I pay a full rent for this bad house. I can't find another house because I'm black, and no one can recommend it me when I apply to rent the house, and I can't pay deposit as well. All these complaints and suffering from this house, it doesn't housing doesn't give me any points to help me found counseling house or even better rent house.
For 6 years, I have been living in my parents' spare room with my daughter and son after my partner died. They're now 6 and 10 and are sharing a room with their 33-year-old daddy. My parents are elderly and disabled, and living conditions are not physically or mentally healthy for anyone involved. We need a home to call our own and live as a family in a healthy environment.
Okay, so that just gives a sense of, some of the direct experiences of the housing and homeless crisis. And I think it's, all of us who are part of this, really hear from those voices the destructive impact on people of this crisis. And really none of us can accept, that situation continuing. I think all of us want to work together to change that and address that. So now I'm going to introduce our first two speakers. Firstly, we're going to have Marissa McMahon, who is a housing campaigner organiser for PPR since 2008, working in support of families in housing need in North and West Belfast. Her involvement arose through personal experience when she and her young daughter faced the prospect of eviction back in 2009. After that, Marissa remained involved in the campaign, lobbying at both EU and UN level to secure interventions regarding long-standing inequality in social housing provision, impacting in particular Catholic families in North Belfast. She also completed both a fellowship and a mentor programme with the Social Change Initiative, which provided an insight into housing inequalities in both South Africa and the US, and has visited both countries on numerous occasions. She will be followed then by Dr. Agustina Martire. Dr. Martire is a senior lecturer in architecture at Queen's University Belfast, with an interest in urban history and theory, specifically in the significance of local mixed streets, their fabric, histories, and experiences. She currently leads the Street Space Project, an international and interdisciplinary project that studies local mixed streets, shedding light on the way streets are used, experienced, and represented. She and her colleagues are compiling a database of publicly owned land and assets across North and West Belfast and the city centre, including ownership status, value, planning, and zoning status and suitability for housing. They are overlaying this data with data on housing need and other deprivation measures. Agustina is also currently being supported by the Department of Communities to examine good practice models for medium density, genuinely mixed and participatory neighbourhoods across Europe. So I'm now going to hand over to Marissa.
That's great. Thank you, Rory, and thanks for everybody for being here today. I'm just going to start my presentation, just making sure that we can all see that. Yeah, nothing's blew up and we're all good. Thanks, Grainia, for that nod of approval. So just as Rory had said, you've heard some of the voices of the families that we work with day and daily that are coming to us asking for help, asking, what more can they do to be less homeless, because the onus always seems to be put on them. And I'm going to give you a very brief 5-10 minute run through of a 10-year campaign. Well, I'm at least going to try. So as Rory says, my own campaigning background and start came from here. You're looking at the 7 Towers in the New Lodge in North Belfast, and this is where I was first introduced to PPR and their way of campaigning. And I worked with other families, other women and kids, and campaigned for better living conditions in these towers. So we were living with things like raw sewage coming up our bath and pigeon waste in our landings and balconies. There was families living, at the very top of these 11th, 12th floors of flats, and not because, you know, they actively chose to live there, because nobody wants to bring their 4 kids up 11 flights of stairs every day to get to their home, but it's because there was nowhere else for them to go. There was no houses being built in and around these areas. So the approach that we took was working and worked well enough that other people across Belfast and other residents in different communities came and asked us, you know, can you help us? Can you show us what it is you're doing that's working? And this is just an example of how it was replicated. Here you can see the Equality Cutway campaigners supporting residents from Rathcoole to have over 100 flats opened for people to be able to live in. We also were asked to come into the Lower Shankill and work with residents there to replicate the approach again. That's seen, I think, the first, was it 30 homes built in the Lower Shankill for the first time in over 20 years. So what we were doing was working, but back to the New Lodge, back to how the 7 Towers residents and, you know, the cleaning up of pigeon waste and stuff like that turned into a wider campaign. And it started with this piece of land here. I don't know if you can see, politicians holding it up. It's Gertwood, former Gertwood Army Barracks in North, so it's absolute stone throw away from the New Lodge in North Belfast. And at the time, I was told by 2 city planners a few years back, it was the most contested piece of land in Western Europe. And the reason being, the outgoing DSD minister at the time had earmarked and had said that there would be roughly about 200 homes built on this piece of land. The incoming minister, Nelson McCausland, cut that by, I think, less than a quarter to roughly 40 odd homes that was to be built in this land. And it resulted in women like me and other women living in hostels and sofa surfing and overcrowded accommodation, thinking to ourselves, do you know what, we're not waiting any longer. Equality can no longer wait. We're always being told, yes, you can have a home, but not just yet. And here was a prime example of, you know, how there could have been a massive dent in the housing crisis that was then in North Belfast, and it was totally obliterated. So this is us down at the then DSD offices with lovely colourful balloons and a load of screaming children, demanding that we were listened to, demanding that we were no longer waiting. So that then moved us on to a mapping exercise, because what happened was every single time we met with people in power and people who held the ability to build homes and you know, sustainable homes, we were told there's no money, there's no resources, there's no land, you can't build there, that's a contested space. We were up against that continually, so we thought, you know what, let's go and map out land, because we walk past vacant pieces of land every day, and that's exactly what we done. We mapped out several pieces of land across North and West Belfast in particular, but it also took in the likes of Soracco and other places in East and Border and South, but North and West because they had the highest housing waiting list at the time. So most of the land was publicly owned. This piece of land wasn't. It was the former Hillview site in North Belfast. So it was privately owned by a millionaire, and in the face of it all, we were told, yous are crazy. Yous are never going to get homes built there. It is never going to happen. And regardless, we ploughed on. And as of a few months ago, there has been a proposal for 18 homes to be built at this site, albeit it's not massive. However, after being told it would never happen, it was definitely something for the campaigners. And if you can see this, what was then derelict old flax mill in the background, lay empty for many years, is now being turned into, I think it's 77 homes through Clonmel Housing Association, and work is underway, and it should be finished by spring next year, which again will be you know, a massive relief to people who are waiting on a home in North Belfast. Another piece of land that was mapped out back then was the Mackey site, a site in West Belfast that is 25 acres, so roughly the quarter the size of a quarter of Belfast city centre. Agustina will correct me on this, no doubt, later on. Something to that effect. It's a massive piece of land that we've been campaigning on, and I've had support from, I don't know if you can see this picture over here, where there was politicians. We held a Christmas vigil where we were up singing songs. Santa came, and there was all sorts of community activists there, as well as the local politicians. We ran a poster campaign over here. This was then the MLAs, I know some of them still are, who supported Build Homes Now and Homes at Mackey's. And we also, down here, if you can see this piece at the bottom, is, confirmation is a letter from Belfast City Council solicitor regarding the open spaces strategy, and it states that it doesn't hinder any requests to rezone Mackey's for social housing or to have any type of social housing on the site. So as families stayed involved and kept campaigning, the campaign it was always families that were campaigning, but it kind of turned to these amazing young people who, many of whom know nothing but homelessness, have been born in a hostel, have grew up in a hostel, or have been sharing a house with their granny, granda, aunts and uncles for their entire life. And they came forward. And this is the face of the campaign. It's the next generation. It's the people that what we're doing now is going to have the most impact on them, and people like my daughter, and I'm sure many other people's children who are on this Zoom today. And I have to say, they're a lot more creative than we were back then, 10 years ago, when we just turned up with our colourful balloons. They're now doing absolutely brilliant stuff, including painting umpteen murals across Belfast. You can probably see them, you have seen them. This one here with the then Lord Mayor, John Finucane, now MP for North Belfast, where he publicly signed a pledge here behind him about putting homes on Mackey's. They have done and wrote and recited poems in, I think, 4 different languages. They have made and starred in a rap music video. I'm not down with the cool kids, I'm hoping I'm saying that right. But here they're still protesting, just a lot more creative than we were back then. But in all seriousness, these are the people that are driving the campaign, that are wanting change for their city and beyond. But it's fair to say that it wasn't and isn't easy, because in the face of all of that campaigning over all those years, and it would be fair to say that it's solely unionist opposition, but mainly unionist opposition to homes being built. And this is just a small example of the types of things that have been blocked. So you can see here, Nelson McCausland back in 2011 taking the 200 homes that were supposed to be there down to roughly around 40. So I mean, less than a quarter. You had the former MP for North Belfast, Nigel Dodds, taking a break here from Brexit negotiations to actively intervene and stop homes being built at Hillview. And over here, a statement from the DUP in North Belfast stating the reasons why. However, regardless of all this, and regardless of even being told all those years ago, you're wasting your time, there's no hope it's going to happen, we continue on. And this is just some of the things we have coming up. Just before I hand over to Agustina, just some of the things that we're involved in. We will be launching a film in the autumn as part of Belfast Film Festival. And this is some of the campaigners up here learning how to use equipment in terms of getting ready to interview people for that film. We have the unbelievably talented Finn Kennedy organising and writing an opera within iOpera for the young people who are involved, to again tell their story on what homelessness and housing inequality looks like for them. And we will be launching a fighting fund to help us with legal costs, as well as working closely and continue to work closely with, as Rory had spoke about earlier on, some of the Take Back the City coalition. So they may tell us we can't do it, but we're doing it anyway. So watch this space, and by all means keep in contact and keep an eye out on our social media to see what we're up to next. I'm going to hand over to Agustina, if that's okay. If I can just stop sharing.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Is everything okay? Thank you. I just wanted to thank PPR in general very, very much for inviting me to be part of this. It's been a real pleasure to be part of the project of Taking Back the City for the past 2 years. And today I wanted to speak particularly about the Mackey site, but I'll give a bit of an introduction of how we get there. So I'm going to talk about places for people, sustainable and equitable housing for Belfast. And let me start with a quote from Leilani Farha from the United Nations. And this is echoing a bit of what Rory was speaking about earlier. She says, private developers and investors now dominate housing systems in an unprecedented fashion, often divorcing housing from its social function by treating it as a commodity for speculation. So using property and land as a way of making money instead of providing houses for people who need them. And then David Harvey, echoing that, says, massive wealth and capital haven't budged one bit so far. We have to give it a huge push if we want to see something different in our society. We need to create mechanisms and forms of organization which reflect the needs and wants of society as a whole, not just privileged class of individuals. So this is where PPR comes in and is such an important force in activism for putting housing for everybody that needs it to the force. So I'm going to be talking very briefly, and then we'll be able to discuss this later, about the analysis we've been doing of the Mackey sites, the public land, and how housing could fit into it. So one of the very important parts of the way that we've collaborated with PPR, with my students from the Street Space Project, is in doing participatory workshops where people that are in need of housing, such as young homeless people or refugees and asylum seekers, in ways that they feel that they need to experience the city and the place that they live in. So we did things like mapping services around the places where they live to see how far they are from where they live. We spent days looking at the Mackey site and walking around it, just looking at the potential and how that place can be very easily turned into an inclusive community that has the interests of these people on board. So looking into the Mackey site, and this is where the numbers comes in, it's actually the total site, including everything, including Invest in I, is 25 hectares, which is quite a lot more than 25 acres, but here's where we go into the detail. What we see here is the Belfast City Council master plan for the Greenway. And this is what was published about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. The land that you see here highlighted in color is the 13 hectares of land owned by the Department for Communities. All of that, it's a huge site, and I'm going to show you some images that show how incredibly big it is. There's two public places, Paisley Park and Woodvale Park, so we're not really discussing those. Those should stay the way they are. And then we have the planned Greenway from the Belfast City Council master plan. Now, this land is to be developed by Braidwater for private housing, and that's at the top of the Mackey site. And we're not really going to touch that because that's already Braidwater. Now, this land here in the master plan, it appears with a label of expected extended footprint of Braidwater site. That land still belongs to the Department for Communities, and it's 2 hectares of land, which can fit, I'll show you the numbers now, how much housing can fit in that one. Now, there's land that doesn't have an assigned use within that land that belongs to the Department for Communities, and it's about 3 hectares, about 2.5 and another half in the site on the right-hand side. So the total land that could be developed for social housing, affordable housing, and mixed tenure is about 5 hectares, and that's without even touching the Greenway. And now, to give a sense of scale, if you look at this map, and I don't know if you can see, can you see my cursor here? So if you go from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, this is all the way from City Hall would be around here, and this is the riverfront. That's Victoria Square, and this is all set to set a scale to it. Imagine how long it takes to walk from City Hall all the way through Victoria Square to the waterfront. This is this is High Street here. So it's a huge piece of land, really. And to put it more into context, if we look at that little site here at the bottom, this building here is Marks and Spencer's in front of City Hall. That's the size of the site. This is how many buildings you could have in a site of that size. But obviously you wouldn't be building things like the city center. You would be building housing, and housing has a different form and a different shape. And of course, we all know mistakes that were made in the 60s with this kind of thing. And Marissa was talking about how the high-rise, especially high-rise that is not properly maintained and that is not properly taken care of by the people who own it, that has not worked historically through the 20th century. Then you have the older version of terraced houses. All of these have the same type of density of units per hectare. So this is the type of terrace that was very common until the mid 20th century. And now there's a different type of kind of compromise between those two, where you still have a good amount of public space and also a certain level of density, where some houses are just a townhouse, some others are terraces, some others are flats. And the idea is to get this gentle density through mixed use, mixed tenure, and public participation. Now, in that little site that we were talking about before, that has about 2 hectares of land, there is, if you only build 2 stories and little bits of 3-story height, you could have 150 units of housing with enough green space to create this kind of gentle density in that site. And it's just physically a very well-connected site to the rest of the area. Now, there's a lot of public land in general in Belfast, and 2 of these most recent cases are the former Ballinafie police station that was public land. Now it's buy-to-let apartments. It used to be earmarked for social housing, and similarly up on Donegal Street at the end where it crosses Millfield, there was an empty site earmarked for social housing, and then a planning application was won by appeal for student accommodation. So again, land that was supposed to be used for social housing has been given to a private developer for them to develop student accommodation. So in conclusion, what we're trying to say here is that, and this is the project that I have been working with the Department for Communities on one side in terms of gentle density, and particularly with PPR, we are looking at mapping over 300 sites and buildings owned by Belfast, in Belfast by government organizations. So all of this public land, and we're in the process of making that map right now, overlapping the housing need and areas of deprivation and a lot of other variables. And what we're trying to say is that this public land should stay in public hands, and it can't be continued to be given or granted or sold to private developers when there is an actual serious housing need. This public land is ready for social housing development, and there are these new models like cooperative or eco-villages, mixed tenure, mixed use, medium and gentle density. There are things that haven't been tried here in Belfast in the past, but could be very easily translated into the needs of the place of today. So I'm going to finish with one final quote that I think has to do with the way that we collaborate with PPR and the people that are in need of housing. Fran Tonkis says, contemporary city design is a matter not only of iconic architecture, flagship projects, or ambitious master plans, but also of formal and informal practices that shape urban environments, produce and address urban problems, organize people, as well as ordering space. So what we're trying to do here is get together the expertise of the people that need places to live, because I think what we believe, a belief that we share with PPR, is that experts are not just the experts on things like housing or spatial or built environment or spatial disciplines, but they are the people that are going to live there are the experts in the way that they want to live in those places. So that's me finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Marissa and Agustina there, two fantastic presentations. I was struck in particular during Marissa's by, I suppose, just the resilience that you and the other families who were affected by, homelessness and the housing crisis had to, determination as well to campaign and, campaign for what you were told was impossible. And I think that's a really important message, that things that we think are impossible can very much become real through that commitment to taking action, to highlighting it. So it was really, I think, inspiring. And Agustina then presenting that, I think, vision and potential for what could be done on public land and the Mackey site, I think is really important. And I love the idea of gentle density, that idea of a density that is sustainable, that is, suitable for communities, but it also brings in the green space as well. And I think the idea that, on that small piece of land, and you were right, I refer to 25 acres, of course, it's actually 64 acres, 25 hectares, that on that small site of 2 hectares, there could be 150 homes built. And that is a very significant figure that would have a real impact on housing. So thank you so much for those presentations. And now we're going to I'm delighted to have Minister Mallon, who is going to the SDLP MLA for North Belfast, Nicola Mallon, who is the Minister for Infrastructure, and her department is partly overseeing proposals for the development of the Greenway on the Mackey site, and she has sent us very kindly a short video to share.
Good morning, and thank you for providing me with this opportunity to address the first of a series of events exploring options to build a sustainable, non-sectarian housing system in Belfast. Since taking up my post as Minister for Infrastructure, I've made it clear that I am committed to people-centred place shaping places around our people, with our people, and for our people. An important part of this for me is developing active travel projects to help support a greener, healthier and more sustainable future for all of our people. Given the importance of active travel and the contribution it can make to improving physical and mental health and well-being, tackling health inequalities, promoting social inclusion and tackling the climate crisis, I have made it my ambition to deliver a green recovery as we emerge from the COVID pandemic. Greenways deliver multiple benefits for local communities, the economy and the environment. That is why I am very keen to develop our Greenway infrastructure in the north and right across our island. And in particular, I want to ensure safe access for those wanting to walk, wheel and cycle, especially for the many people who can't afford to own a car. Greenways and community paths can make a huge difference to daily life by providing the opportunity to enjoy safe and easy access to fresh air and exercise, encouraging more people to walk and cycle for everyday journeys, more children to walk or cycle to school, and to provide leisure resources for local people and visitors alike. The Fourth Meadow Community Greenway is a Belfast City Council project, which I am supporting through my Blue-Green Infrastructure Fund. I have committed £750,000 to the project. This urban greenway will connect, hopefully, the many families and children living in new social and affordable homes in this site and the wider community in North and West Belfast by walking and cycling paths between Clarendon Playing Fields, Springfield Dam and Falls Park. It will provide opportunities to foster many positive and long-term relationships between people from all sections of the community. And I am confident that it will complement housing development in the area that it passes through. I am pleased that the delivery of this greenway has started, and my department will continue to work with Belfast City Council to see it delivered, especially for those who will live alongside it and those who will visit it. We have an acute social housing shortage, particularly in North and West Belfast. We need to build many more new homes, but we also need to build sustainable communities with the right access to facilities, services, and the right type of infrastructure. COVID has shown us the importance of having access to open, green, safe space and the positive impact it has on our quality of life. The Forth Meadow Community Greenway for me is about better connecting people in North and West Belfast, enhancing their quality of life and leaving an enduring legacy to be enjoyed by future generations. The truth is that the status quo was leaving so many of our citizens behind before COVID. The pandemic has exacerbated further the inequalities in our society. As we emerge from it, we have a duty for social, economic, environmental and moral reasons to challenge the status quo. We are at a fork in the road, and to quote Robert Frost, "Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference." What is the point of us being here if we aren't making a difference? Thank you again to PPR for the opportunity to share my views, and I hope you all enjoy the event.
And thank you to Minister Mallon for that short message. I think there was some really important points brought up there in terms of particularly the context, which I hadn't mentioned in my introduction, which I should have, and I suppose it is an important one in the COVID context of the COVID pandemic that has made us all reassess the importance of home and the importance of green space and how we design new housing and how we deliver it and the importance of providing it. And I think the COVID pandemic should be giving us an added impetus to address housing as a key fundamental health measure as well. And it was great that the Minister took the time to confirm as well that the Greenway doesn't preclude the development of social housing at Mackey's, and also very helpful to hear the Department for Infrastructure is keen to support the work of Take Back the City, and we'd like to invite the Minister and her staff to be involved in the next stage of our work, and we look forward to that. Now, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Grainia Long, who is the Chief Executive of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, to speak next, to present the Northern Ireland Housing Executive's response to the issues of homelessness and climate collapse in Belfast. And Grainia is well placed to comment on these challenges as the head of the Housing Authority for Northern Ireland, one of the largest publicly owned social landlords in Europe. Previously, Grainia was the Commissioner for Resilience for the City of Belfast and co-chaired the Belfast Climate Commission. Grainia was also the Chief Executive of the National Child Protection Charity in the Republic of Ireland, the ISPCC Childline. This position followed several years working in housing, including as Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Housing and previously Director of the Chartered Institute of Housing in Northern Ireland. She served 2 terms as a member of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, was a member of the Lions Commission on Housing Supply, and advisor to the Best Commission on the Future in Housing in Northern Ireland. Grainia, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you today and hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Rory, and thank you so much to everyone. It's been a fantastic event. Learned a huge amount already, and plenty more to come, no doubt. So huge thank you and congratulations on the work so far, and particularly Marissa and Agustina. I thought those presentations were excellent. I'm sure we'll want to meet up and talk further. I wanted to spend a bit of time this morning just to go over where we're up to as in terms of housing within the Housing Executive. I've been in post as Chief Exec since the 1st of April, probably still very much considered a newbie, but as Rory has said, I've had a number of roles in housing. But part of the reason I was really keen to speak today was when you sent me the brief. I mean, the brief, we must create inclusive, equitable, socially, ecologically and financially sustainable neighbourhoods. Who would disagree with that principle? No one at this point, given the lessons we've had to learn from COVID, could disagree with the principle that what we need are genuinely sustainable neighbourhoods. The work that we're doing within the Housing Executive, for example, in terms of our climate planning, we're now mapping all of our work against the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as we should do. So when we talk about sustainability, we need to talk about it in the round. We need to talk about social and environmental, as well as other forms of sustainability, including economic sustainability. I also have to say, I really strongly agree with the point that the status quo is not an option. And from my perspective, that's for a number of reasons. But I think what's particularly obvious is the status quo is not an option because, first of all, it's unacceptable for too many people. and that's particularly for the most vulnerable. And we heard early on today, really clear stories and the lived experience from people living in our city that are having to face unacceptable levels of waiting for housing. So that's the first reason the status quo is not an option, because of the effect on our fellow residents of the city, but also because human rights law is very clear about the progressive realisation of rights. In other words, we must always move forward. We take our human rights, I certainly take the Northern Ireland Housing Executive's human rights responsibilities really seriously as a duty bearer, Rory, as you said earlier, and that's for a number of reasons, because I'm obliged to, but also it's the right thing to do. And actually, I spent 6 years working as a human rights commissioner at the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. What I actually learned, and I learned a lot of things working in that role, but actually just the impact that taking a human rights-based approach has on the effectiveness of organisations is really profound, and it's very obvious. And so, in fact, I had a meeting with the Chief Commissioner, with Les Allenby at the Human Rights Commission. We're now looking at a number of ways in which we can pilot and take a number of programmes currently ongoing within the Housing Executive and take a human rights-based approach. But anyway, that's kind of a little bit about why this event is really important to me. I spent a number of years working in housing. I started out in homelessness. I'm personally really passionate about resolving issues around homelessness and housing supply, but also housing standards. It's an area that I've focused on throughout my career, and when I was at the Human Rights Commission was part of some of the work they undertook on human rights, an assessment of the application of human rights standards for traveller accommodation. So working now in the Housing Executive, I'm acutely aware of where the priorities lie, and I want to talk a little bit about that this morning. But just to be clear, the Housing Executive has a legal responsibility as a duty bearer in terms of its human rights responsibilities, and that's I'm very clear about that, and we're very clear about that as an organisation. But also, it has a very clear role in relation to the positive equality duties in Northern Ireland. And that's something that we take a very proactive approach to. I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time talking about the Housing Executive. I think as an organisation, everybody knows what it is, and it was set up 50 years ago this year. And any chance I get to say we're 50 years old, I will always take it. But I mentioned the setting up of the organisation because it actually chimes with a number of the issues that you've already raised. It was established to ensure that social housing was administered in a fair and an impartial manner, and to address chronic undersupply and quality issues. And so many of what you've talked about already this morning, unfortunately, still resonates. Here we are 50 years on, and some of those issues still resonating. So we can't be naive enough, and nobody in this virtual room is naive enough to think that just because things happen positively for a number of years that we keep those positive aspects of housing change. Progressive realisation of rights is ongoing work, and here we are, as I say, in 2021 with some of the challenges ahead of us. Just to mention, and it's something I'm kind of grappling with now coming into the role, Housing Executive is quite a unique organisation. It's actually legally two organisations in one. It's the Strategic Housing Authority for Northern Ireland. So it is responsible for assessing need, for allocating on the basis of need, for administering housing benefit. Well over 500 million pounds a year we administer in housing benefit. We administer private sector grants. So, for example, people who have a disability will come to us and apply for a disabled facilities grant, for example, for their home. We administer and work in partnership with voluntary community sector organisations to administer supporting people funding, so ensuring that people with housing support needs get funding for housing support services. And we're the Home Energy Conservation Authority for Northern Ireland. So there's a huge amount there as a strategic housing authority, but really importantly for the purposes of this discussion, we manage our own land, and we oversee the building of social housing in the new build programme. So that's the strategic housing side. Probably the bit that we're most known for on the ground, I suppose, is the fact that we're also, as Rory said, a very large landlord. We're the biggest landlord, biggest public sector landlord, certainly on these islands and much further afield. And that part of the house, so to speak, is funded almost entirely from rental income. So every decision I have to take in relation to the landlord, I take very seriously, because that's our tenants' income. That's the rent that they have paid for their housing. But what we cannot do, unfortunately, is cross-subsidise. So I cannot take any funding from the landlord to spend on the strategic side. So the only reason I covered all of that was just to mention that today. It's important that that's kind of understood. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problems and then we'll come on to the solutions. And the problems are really well known. And in fact, no one could say it better than the people affected. As we heard earlier on, the number on the waiting list for social housing is at 43,000. That's a Northern Ireland figure. And those deemed to be in urgent housing need at 28,000 is a historic high. So we are at acute levels of need. We already had systemic issues in relation to housing need before COVID-19, but of course, as has been said already, and Minister Mallon said it very clearly, COVID-19 has exacerbated and accelerated a number of those issues. The levels of homelessness are acute, and those in chronic need of support are at a critical level. And the number for me that I carry around literally on a daily basis and spend a lot of time thinking about and working on is the fact that we have seen a 110% increase in temporary accommodation last year, and that is unacceptable levels of use of temporary accommodation. So we're placing too many people in temporary accommodation for periods that are too long. Temporary accommodation is meant to be just that. It's meant to be for short periods. And as somebody who spent a lot of their time campaigning against the placement of children in particular in emergency accommodation for long periods, I am not happy that that is a situation that we find ourselves in. So I've already asked my colleagues to come up with a solution for how we reduce the number of children in emergency accommodation right down to a number of days, and we will be addressing that in the weeks and months to come, and I've asked for urgent action on that. In terms of supply, we have a projected social housing need over between now and 2025 for 5,000 homes in Belfast, which you will very well know. But actually, just to set it out in stark terms, as I say, a projected need of over 5,000 homes. Last year, 303 social homes were completed in Belfast. Now, there were 790 starts, and I will talk about what's to come in this year in Belfast in terms of completions to come. But just that number shows we are, in my view, we have found ourselves as a housing system structurally incapable of closing that gap using the models that we're using. So I'm actually agreeing with what has been said earlier about the models that we are using are not getting us to where we want to be. We can spend a lot of time talking about how we got there, but I don't think that helps the people that we all want to help and the people that I serve, the public and the residents of Belfast, to ensure that we have the right homes in the right places. So something has to give. We need a new set of levers and we need to do that fast. Time is against us. I just want to talk a little bit, Rory, if that's okay, on about the existing stock, because quite rightly Marissa mentioned it too. You know, my responsibility is to ensure working with housing associations that we bring forward new supply, but I also have to ensure that the stock that we have is well looked after, well maintained, because the health and well-being of people in those homes is critically important too. And we do that in a number of ways, as you know, as a landlord. But what we face is a £3 billion gap in our funding in this decade to tackle a backlog of repairs and maintenance and ongoing planned repairs. So that's also ahead, and I will come on to in the solutions what we're trying to do to address that. I'm just going to keep an eye on time, Roy, so that you don't shout at me. So I want to finish by talking a little bit about our vision for the future. First of all, I believe passionately that housing is core to our economic, our social and our environmental recovery from COVID, and it's central to inclusive growth. If we're going to have a really sustainable approach to growth in the city, which I believe in, then we must have housing at the heart of that. The Housing Executive is a people-centred organisation, and as I said, we want to take and are taking a human rights-based approach to our work. This year, so just to move on to some of the positives, we will invest 217 million in our homes across Northern Ireland to ensure to upgrade our stock at pace. We have a planned maintenance programme coming through in the next number of years, and what's important is that we'll create at least 50 apprenticeships a year, and we intend to do more than that. So again, I've asked my colleagues where we can dial that up. I want to see our maintenance, our investment, actually delivering jobs in local areas, and I think we can do that. I've made homelessness a core priority for the Housing Executive. It's a personal priority for me. We've developed a reset plan, and as I said, critical to that is ensuring that we are reducing right down the number of families in emergency accommodation, that we are reducing down where we can placements in the temporary accommodation for prolonged periods, and I will be holding myself and the organisation to account in how we do that in the year to come. And I think we've got a very difficult period ahead for those families and households. I suppose on a positive, we managed, and when I say we, I mean the organisations responsible for delivery of social housing associations, and ourselves ensured that we met and exceeded our targets for social housing last year, even during COVID-19. And Rory, you will no doubt be very aware that that has not been the case in other jurisdictions, including the Republic of Ireland. So we met and exceeded our targets for social housing last year, and we have a very ambitious target for social housing for this year. But just to say, in Belfast there are currently 1,462 social homes under construction. So actually the future is very bright in terms of the level of new homes in social housing coming forward. That is cold comfort to people on the housing list. They need that now, but the fact that we have that pipeline of construction is a good news story. And Rory, I promise I'll finish. This is just my last number of comments. The other piece of work that I wanted to mention is the amount of work we're doing to bring land forward. We are undertaking detailed site assessments. I've asked for them to be accelerated, and we are looking in every possible case at the land that we can bring forward, and we are doing that with housing associations to ensure that where we can, that land is made available. No doubt you'll want to discuss that more. I've certainly made a personal commitment. My personal view as a housing professional is that Belfast is weakened economically, socially and environmentally by not having a permanent residential population in the city centre. And we need to address that. That will take, we have a decade of a combination of house building and house conservation ahead to ensure that we have a permanent city centre population. And the housing executive's view, and has been clear to council on this, is that a 20% proportion of social and affordable housing as part of private developments should be the norm, and we've been making that clear. Final points just to mention is the issue of ensuring that we are climate resilient as a city, and that's been very close to my heart given my previous role as resilience commissioner. The housing executive, I'm delighted to say, is investing millions in retrofit in Belfast right now. We will retrofit nearly 1,000 homes in Belfast in the next 3 years. That's a whole load of households and families where their homes will be fit for the future, and we will be able to bring down their energy bills, and we want to do much more than that. But that number enables us to innovate at scale and to really now start to test out the technology that we need. And we're also looking, I've asked the team to look in a lot of detail now quickly at rewilding in our estates, for example, and a whole range of measures that we can take as a landlord to ensure that we are contributing to ensure we're contributing ecologically to the ecological future of the city, and not just on climate resilience. Final point, a lot of people are asking me about the Minister's statement in relation to revitalisation last November, and transformation of the organisation so that we can borrow to invest in our stock, close down that gap in funding, and also borrow to build again. And that's a really exciting proposition for the organisation in terms of enabling us, freeing us up to borrow. The nature of that borrowing, there will be huge debate about. I don't think we need to get into that today. But I guess the one thing I would say is we're not waiting to 2025 to do all of this. What I've set out for you today is work that's happening just now and that we will be taking forward. So while revitalisation is critical and we will move fast, actually there's a huge amount of work that we need to do now, and we're getting on with, and we will be doing that in partnership with many of the organisations in this room, and no doubt I'm very happy to talk more in the future. Rory, I have gone over, I apologise, but thank you, and again, thanks for involving me today.
Thank you so much, Grainia, for that. Great to feel your energy around this. You know, new in the job, but it's really, I think, often so much of this can be, you know, approached in a very, you know, almost statistical manner, or kind of, you know, a cold policy approach, but you're definitely bringing, you know, that commitment to human rights and that human approach and energy, and I think is really clearly needed. Because even with the homes that you've set out that are in planning for building, you know, that's, you know, insufficient in terms of what's needed, and there is so much more. But I think it's great to see that human rights frame to your work. And there'll be, you know, a couple of questions in the Q&A specifically around Mackey's and that, and what, you know, how you can engage with us around that. So we'll come back to that because I am conscious of the time, but I really appreciate you giving the time and being part of it. And I really look forward to working with you on this project into the future. So thank you again. Now, our next speaker, I'm absolutely delighted to have with us today is, and I know as all of us in the coalition are delighted to have here today as well, is Alistair Reid, who is the Director of Place and Economy for Belfast City Council. Alistair Reid joined Belfast City Council in May 2018 and leads on planning, economic development, culture and regeneration. An experienced and passionate city placemaker, he was brought up in Edinburgh, studied in Glasgow, and has held a range of city development roles in Belfast, Bristol and Leicester. He is a successful leader of major projects in regeneration, in highways, transportation, culture, community and physical development. So I'd like to hand it over to you, Alistair.
Thank you very much, Rory. It's terrible what you write about yourself on LinkedIn, which becomes your kind of story that's repeated again and again. I guess one little bit I will add to my story, which is perhaps in the deficit column, is I am kind of here to learn. And one of the intriguing parts for me is taking a rights-based approach to housing. And I would just kind of lodge that as something that Grainia has spoken about, Rory, you've spoken and written about, and is very much at the core of PPR's work. But just to say, my own approach to city development has been more of a holistic approach as to how do you join up your responses to the economic challenges that you face and how these are impacted by health issues, education issues, crime, and indeed housing. So my background is perhaps something that is going to be challenged through this process. But as I say, I'm here to learn, and part of that learning was really kicked off by the comments that Marissa made in terms of her own experience, in terms of a campaigner, community leader, and the impact that that's had on the actions of the kind of institutions of government around it. So particularly so interested to hear that and challenged by it. And then also Agustina's kind of academic practitioner approach there, so that there was a huge amount in that for me. And then to hear from Grainia. Grainia is somebody I've known for the last 3 years since I've been in Belfast. So and that's, I'll come on to how we want to work with the housing executive. So some interesting stuff. What I wanted to just touch on is from a council perspective, the policy background that we can use to get ourselves into this space and to promote and engage in that conversation around housing development. I want to talk about some of the specifics that we've done in terms of how we've been looking at our own land, public sector land, say a little bit about planning, a little bit about sustainability, environmental sustainability, which is obviously high on our agenda at the moment, and then finish off with a couple of comments about some of the challenges that the Mackey site particularly throws up for us. So in terms of policy, the policy context here, the City Council through the Community Planning Partnership has a huge ambition for the city. We want the city to grow by 2035. We want the city to grow by 66,000 people. We think that that's the way that the economy is going to work in the society of Belfast. We are a city of 300,000 people. Historically, we are 500,000 people. So there is a room to move that trajectory upwards. The work that was done around the Belfast agenda did set out therefore commensurate aspirations around housing, but I think it was a flaw in the process at the time that we didn't account for the existing demand within the city, and that's something that we will be taking into the review of the Belfast agenda, which is a piece of work that's currently been undertaken through the Community Planning Partnership. But if we took that 66,000 people, we have an aspiration to facilitate the development of 31,000 additional homes in the city by 2035. 8,000 of these, addressing Grainia's earlier point, being anticipated within the city centre. So we have a kind of pro-growth agenda for the city, and a key part of that is housing growth. And there has been some success. I mean, Grainia gave you some figures, but according to the Housing Land Availability Monitor, I think from April 2015 to the 31st of March 2020, there were almost 3,500 new homes completed in this city. So there is a trajectory of growth ambition. It's been translated into the local development plan, and there is a degree of success in terms of house building, and that's not to negate anything we've heard about people's experience before. So homes, housing is a big political issue at the moment within the City Council. We have been asked as officers to put that very much within our focus. We're doing that both internally within the council and then through the work we're doing on the Community Planning Partnership. We have a city development board that sits under the partnership that brings together a range of public, private sector delivery partners in order to bring forward the appropriate residential development, specifically in relation to assessing the availability of public sector land. So very much the approach that Agustina was promoting earlier, that's something that we've been doing. And I guess the important learning out of this is that at some point we sit down and say, right, what have you identified? What have we identified? Let's kind of work that through. Obviously, there's a huge issue of prioritisation in that. As we'll all know here, some pieces of land are much more easy to develop than others, and we should be doing some assessment on that basis. So looking at issues of ownership, suitability, and what have you. We also recognise that there is a need to link to the private sector. So in meeting the needs and demands of housing within the city, while social and affordable are critically important and have enhanced importance in terms of a regeneration strategy, it's important that we do recognise the private sector is going to have a role in meeting the future needs of housing in the city. In terms of our existing COVID recovery work, again, we've established housing as a core part of that, and we have said that we do need to bring these public land assets forward to appropriate funding mechanisms to accelerate city centre living, delivery of mixed tenure homes, and to maximise opportunities and to deal with housing stress. So there's a very sound policy background to what we're doing. In terms of the specific work I've referred to, we are currently actively engaged with the Department for Communities, Department for Infrastructure, housing associations, private developers and investors to facilitate this housing development. We've, through our initial focus on identifying available land, focused initially on the city centre. We had looked at 14 available sites. We've now got to a point where within the inner northwest of the city, we've now issued a development brief to housing associations for lands in our ownership and DFC ownership to bring forward mixed use, mixed tenure development. So that's just sitting at in that area between Castle Court round to Ulster University. So very specific intervention in there. And I think previously has been mentioned the work at the gas works. So we have been working with the Housing Association in respect to bringing forward land at the gas works, and a master plan for that, bringing forward 94 units is in the pipeline and soon to be on site. In terms of we are the planning authority, there are a number of kind of pieces of what we might call institutional friction in the planning system in Belfast. However, if we look at the 30,000 houses that we would seek to facilitate the building of up to 2035, I think 20,000 of these are either already consented or are on zoned land. So there shouldn't be a huge planning impediment to bringing forward housing in the city, although that's something that we will continue to engage with Department for Infrastructure and Department for Communities. Indeed, we are drafting our response to the DFC Housing Supply Strategy call for evidence, and we are highlighting some of the kind of so-called checks and balances, but things that often just seem to get in the road of bringing forward housing through the planning system at speed. So that's an area where we'll focus on. I did want to touch on sustainable housing. It is Grainia mentioned retrofit in terms of one of the key ways that the council will or the city will address its carbon footprint. There are other kind of issues there that we are very keyed up on in terms of the local development plan that's currently going through process, better integration between transport and land use planning, increased urban densities. That kind of meets Agustina's issue. There is a balance between high rise and that kind of medium density approach. Reuse of brownfield land, repurposing of existing buildings, energy efficiency and green design, avoiding flood risk areas, sustainable drainage systems, green and blue infrastructure. So we've heard talk about the Greenway, which is an important issue for the city. That connectivity is important. We can't really have you can't have good housing if it's not connected through the city in the right way. So there's a whole range of activities that we are undertaking to ensure that when that housing comes forward, that there is the kind of zero carbon or the carbon reduction agenda being considered as we go. Grainia did mention city centre living. We, like Grainia, do recognise that for the sake of the future of Belfast, a city centre population, mixed multi-tenure, mixed community is going to be critically important. And when you would look at some of the cities in England where and the stories often told about, and I don't quote me on these figures, but they did come from a professor at Queen's University, where Manchester 25 years ago had 1,000 people living in the city centre. Now it's got 100,000 people living in the city centre. So there is something about that approach, which will be part private, part social, part affordable, that we will continue to work on. Just finally, conscious of time, I do want to touch on the Mackie's site in particular. It is a challenge to the City Council. We do not own that site, and I know it's the red line, if you like, is a matter of conjecture in some ways, and Agustina's kind of really useful overviews gave us showed kind of the extent and scale of that. But in the main, that is a piece of land owned by DFC and Invest NI. The existing purposes for holding that site is an employment site in the existing plan. Rightly, Marissa highlighted that the City Council's position is that can change. This could be changed through the rezoning through the local development plan, and that's a discussion that we need to have. But it is that challenge of it not being in our ownership. It is zoned for employment land, and it's a strategic site in terms of there is not a lot of other employment land in that area, and that's ultimately a matter of political will. So where that will sit in our future aspiration. So there is a huge political conversation that we'll need to overlay this as we move it forward. It is, as has been alluded to here, it is an area of interface. These issues will need to be very well handled as we move forward. But that's certainly a conversation we have. We would want to advocate the need for greenway. Connectivity is critical, and we are working with DFC and DFI on bringing the greenway forward. So again, if you go back to my own approach to cities, which has been that holistic, it is about jobs, it is about housing, it's about connectivity, it's about health, it's about education. So all of, it's not one for all. Although I am interested in hearing that argument, that housing as the right, and is there a hierarchy there? I don't know. I guess it's really that comes down to a political choice that we will advise elected members both through the planning process and the City Growth and Regeneration Committee, and politicians will ultimately make their choices on that. But so to go back, we have a policy background that is very much focused on enhancing the number of homes that are built and brought forward in the city. We are very conscious that we are not the housing authority, so our role here is to facilitate and work with partners, whether they be DFC, DFI, very keen on working through the City Growth Board, and we are in conversation with Grainia as to how firmly a role the housing executive can play in that. There are planning issues that we will deal with both strategically and site-specific, that we are always looking for a better way through. Sustainability, environmental, carbon reduction remains very much at the core of our thinking. And on the Mackie's site, there's lots of political choices to be made on that, but there's conversations to be had. So I don't know what time, how long that was, Rory, but I'll leave it there.
No.
There's a few minutes left for conversation.
Listen, Alistair, thanks so much. I really appreciate that. It was great to hear, and I think what I took mostly from that, in terms of not mostly, but the most important thing was your phrase going forward around this, which I think is for us very important, that how we progress this. And today is just the start obviously there's a lot of work gone into today, but in terms of moving this journey on to actually delivery, it is really great that you've set out that you're, you know, happy to look at this and look at how we can move it forward. And you've set out a number of potential challenges, which we will need to look at and discuss. And, you know, hopefully, and we believe we can work through those. But it is really positive to hear that, that engagement and that, you know, saying that this is possible. But obviously there are challenges around that.
I just to in a sense, as an officer of the council, to make it clear that these issues will be resolved through the political process rather than the officer process. So I just give you that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I understand that. And I just maybe before, there is a number of questions, and encourage people to put in the Q&A there. And I'm conscious our time is moving on as well. And I want to give time to Hugh, who has been a very important part of this process. And as well, before we close, I want to make sure we have time for that. And I think we do want to close at 11:30 or maybe 25 to at the latest. But I want to go maybe back to you, Grainia. Alistair, you know, when it gave his perspective on the Mackey site in particular, and maybe you could you give your perspective, kind of responding to the presentations from Agustina and Marissa, and that idea of, you know, how could you see, or would you see the role of the NHG in progressing this?
Yeah, thanks, Rory. I'm sorry, my neighbour's getting work done. So here's where Zoom meetings at home. So you've got
okay, we can hardly hear it.
Brad, I shouldn't have said anything you've never known. So I mean, the Mackey site clearly is a critical site, and there are a number of critical sites around Belfast that are being looked at in the context of what we've all talked about, which is acute housing need. So what the housing executive role in this is, we will undertake, and we are doing, site assessments across the city on a routine basis. And as I said, you have asked for those to be accelerated, and we use those site assessments to identify need, and then where we see sites that we think can be available, we will have those conversations with housing associations, because as you know, and you're probably all tired of hearing about this, the housing executive itself can't build, we're not a delivery agent, and so on. So that's where we're at with that. So Mackey's is one of a number of sites that we, you know, it's a site of interest. And what we have always said is, and I will always say in relation to any site, is if the owner of a site plus the relevant powers who can take the decision, so to Alistair's point, usually not officers, these are usually political decisions, have the view that that site should be used for example, social housing, then the role of the housing executive in that case is to ensure that we are a partner in ensuring that we're advising on is there need there. So our role there as a strategic housing authority would be to confirm whether or not there's need on that site, and then we would then be as the convener, or as the organisation that aids housing associations, we would then be working with housing associations to enable the funding, the capital fund for new build on that site. So that, I suppose that is what our role, and I can't step beyond that role, Rory, nor would you want me to, you know what I mean? So that's what we would do. I'll never miss an opportunity to say it, so I'll just go ahead and say it. You know, the housing executives, we currently cannot acquire homes even on our own estates. So even, so we are legally unable to add to new supply, and that, to me personally, is deeply frustrating, because I think I can see real opportunities actually where the housing executive as a landlord could acquire homes, particularly where we have estates, or we have high proportions of social housing. We can see on a daily basis where we could meet need, and we're unable to do that. But to be very fair to housing associations, and the fact that they met and exceeded their targets last year in the middle of a pandemic, there were our neighbouring jurisdictions, sorry to say it, Rory, did not do that. And in Scotland, Wales and England, there are parts of Scotland and Wales and England that did that met and exceeded their targets, but there are many parts that didn't. So we have, to be fair to housing associations, they did a very good job last year. And somebody asked the question in terms of the numbers, were they the numbers within the programme for government? So the kind of the programme for government that is concluding, there was a target for 8,000 homes. Essentially, that target will have almost been met. So we had a number of years where the target was met on an annual basis. Then we had a couple of years in 1920 and in 2020, 19 and 20, where the target wasn't met. But the very good year last year has allowed us to meet that, to exceed and to eat into that deficit. And I think this year we'll do that again. So we are on course. And I think that it's important that I say that, because we do talk a lot about housing deficits, but in this particular year, the year just gone, it's important that we give credit where it's due, that people did really go above and beyond to get new supply into the ground.
Thanks, Grainia, for that. And maybe just as someone else asked a question, Alistair, just that whole, I suppose, perspective that PPR has brought, and is key within planning. Agustina raised it as well, and is the idea of participation and community participation. How does in terms of your planning approach, do you engage that, or how do you see yourselves progressing that?
So, well, I mean, there are lots of opportunities for engagement. I think if you take the kind of grand planning approach, so community planning is built on a whole kind of communication participation approach with communities. So the Belfast agenda was reached at a point after a huge public engagement process, and the priorities of the city generally agreed. And then as we kind of deliver these priorities, then you're into organisation or organised participation. So the voluntary and community sector are very much represented on both the community planning partnership itself and the boards underneath that. Through the formal kind of land use development management process, I suppose it's a bit more structured than that, in that the planning system is a quasi-judicial system. There are a set of rules and regulations as to what is advertised, notified, when, and the opportunity for people to feed into that process. But I think very importantly, and this is a view I've held for many years before I came from Belfast, planning rightly sits as a local government function. So local councillors make decisions on planning issues, albeit they don't perhaps have as much freedom around that as they would like, and have articulated directly to myself. There are lots of kind of rules around predetermination, but it rightly sits as a local government function. So if a controversial scheme were to come forward, it would ultimately rest in the hands of locally elected representatives, and they would obviously take community view on board in that regard. So I guess that's the kind of it's part formal, part informal processes where we engage.
I'm just going to ask before we go to Hugh and finish up, Agustina and Marissa, if they want to either ask Alistair or Grainia a question, or just make a comment themselves in terms of the discussion of what you've heard.
I think, is it okay if I come in,
Yeah.
Marissa? Is that okay? I suppose the conversation that we need to keep on having is, even though all that housing has been provided, what type is it? How is it contributing to this kind of more sustainable, more inclusive, human rights-based way of doing housing? I think from my side, the thing that I've been looking at is mixed use and mixed tenure, but there's many different ways of understanding that. And sometimes the word is not enough to provide proper, inclusive housing that is linked to all the needs of the people that need to live there. So I think more than a question, is just like an opening for a future conversation on that particular aspect of it.
I mean,
if Alistair, come back.
If it wants a response, in the sense, it's not a kind of binary, kind of closed answer, but certainly the approach that the City Council's adopted is to bring into the local development plan a requirement that future housing development of major schemes will have a 20% social housing allocation within them. Now, it's quite interesting that that's been applied here. There is no requirement at this stage, not until we adopt the current local development plan strategy will that come into effect. But the members of the council here were very keen that we did adopt that that strategy. That will mean us working very much in not so much tandem, but triangulating with the City Council as the planning authority, developers and the housing executive, so that when mixed tenure, when developments come forward, it is ensuring they are mixed tenure. Now that doesn't get cut across the programmes that Grainia will be running to provide social housing per se, but this is just an additional avenue to ensuring that there is that mixed supply of housing within the city.
Great, thanks, Alistair. Marissa?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Grainia, did you want to say something there and then I can come in?
No,
Go ahead.
I can come in after you, Marissa, if you want. You go ahead.
Yeah, that's okay, Grainia, thanks.
Are you sure? Just no, I just wanted to say, first of all, thanks very much again. But to both Alistair and Grainia, you have both spoke about site and site potential and site assessments, and would you be up for, I know, conditions permitting with COVID regulations, you know, a meet up and a walk around the site at Mackey's as a potential, you know, with families, just to hear some of their ideas? Would that be an option in the future?
Yes, it's definitely an option. I mean, I wouldn't rule anything out at this stage. We certainly, there's a conversation. I also would say, following Grainia's point, that I wouldn't want to come at this fixated on the Mackey's site. I know that there's a strong push here, but there are other sites, so like other brands are available. So there are other sites in the city where it might be quicker and easier to bring forward housing development on. And that piece of work that Agustina was leading on, and that we've, I mean, we're all looking at sites. So it's more interesting for me to say, let's look at what everyone's come up with and see, are we covering everything? So I absolutely understand the campaigning strength of flagging, you know, gathering around the Mackey's site, but I wouldn't want to be fixated on that.
Grainia, thanks, Alistair.
Yeah, so just to, I suppose, start with Augustina's point, I think it's a really important point, and it exercises me constantly as a housing professional. It's not just about new homes, although of course it is, but it's about the right homes, well designed, sustainably. What do they add to, what value do they add to a city, to a community, to a rural or an urban area? So I think we've got an awful lot more to do. And I say this, like I mean UK housing, Irish housing has a lot more to do in terms of what it designs, how it builds, and so on. And I would love to say that this could be the decade in which we think very differently about the places, the design of those places, the integration between housing, water, energy, green spaces. You know, if you look at other cities, they do it brilliantly. And I think if we had the wherewithal, which I think we do, we could do it in a leap rather than, because we are quite far behind, I think, in some of this, in terms of the integration between the built environment and other forms of infrastructure. And I always talk about housing as infrastructure, and I feel passionately about that. It is infrastructure, and you know, except it suits people to call it infrastructure when it suits them, and then when it doesn't suit them. So I've always been of the view we need to call it infrastructure and fund it as such. Of course, I'm very happy to look at sites and to look at an individual site. I would say my colleagues are on the ground across North Belfast and know every inch, you know, and I'm very happy for me personally to go and see that. But the Housing Executive is a locally based organisation, so we know that area, we know the site very well already. So of course I am. I mean, again, for every conversation I will have about the Mackey site, I will have conversations with local communities on sites all over Northern Ireland. So I'll always just add that you know, my powers are limited on a site by site basis often. But look, very happy to do that. And just the final point, if I had a kind of a plea generally, is this has to be the decade in which we build net zero emissions housing. We have to get on with it. It's taking too long, and we have to make, you know, really robust changes now to our building regulations. And I nearly said radical, and it's not radical, because actually it has to be, it just has to happen. We're not going to get to 2050 if we don't make those changes now, and if we put it in the too difficult box, it won't happen. So I couldn't say strongly enough that the real challenge in this decade has to be how we ensure that what we build doesn't add to the problem. And I'm really concerned that it currently is. Factually, it is. Anything that we build that's not net zero emissions we're going to have to retrofit in that lifetime, and that's not good from a public value perspective. But it's just not good because we know where we have to get to by 2050. But that's, I'm sure, for another day.
Thank you. And I'm going to take one last question that has come to me, and it's something I know that we all kind of need to think about before I go to Hugh to close, is the question of public bodies, and obviously, Grainia, you would know this very well, and their own equality and human rights obligations within Northern Ireland, under international treaties, but also within the particular Northern Ireland context that goes beyond politics, and that is about ensuring the human rights, and in this case, the human right to housing and housing need is met. Have you got a reflection or thought on that, Grainia and Alistair, and then we'll go to you.
Have you got a day and a half? I mean, this is something I could talk about forever. I feel, I mean, it's obvious Northern Ireland is way ahead in terms of the protections that it gives to us, to each of us as individuals, from an equality perspective and a human rights perspective. So we're starting with a really good, we are in a really good place. 20 years of progressive equality legislation, progressive human rights legislation, and the institutions to underpin them, I think, has been phenomenal, and actually doesn't get talked about enough. I'm talking now I'm talking on a personal basis as somebody who's been close to equality and human rights legislation for some time. So I think we need to continue to talk about them. From a public body point of view, I think, Rory, it comes down to leadership and it comes down to culture, because you can tell the organisations that have equality and human rights at their heart, because they talk about it and they think about it and they live it and they breathe it, and they don't get it right every day. But actually, the people in the organisation, I see this in the Housing Executive. I say this genuinely as somebody new to the organisation. I've come into an organisation and I see on a regular basis housing professionals who care about people and who care about the dignity of the human person. And that's fundamentally what human rights is about in practice. So I think, from my perspective, if you get the culture right, yes, you need to understand your legal obligations, but if you need to understand that, what does that look like in practice? If you treat people in the right way, if you care about what happens to the person that you're making the decision about, if you don't do it onto people, and I'm not suggesting we get that right every day. There will be plenty of occurrences where people feel we've made decisions onto them as opposed to with them. But I think the Housing Executive is certainly a stronger organisation than others for that. I would say I think we've got a real opportunity now as an organisation to be much more participative. I think we've got some great structures in place, but I still think we consult and engage rather than actually do real participation. So I'd like us to do more of that. So I think that's an exciting part for the future. But culture is just as important as the legal obligations, as everybody being able to ream off, Section 75 and fill out your returns. That's not what it's about.
Great, thanks, Grainia. Alistair?
Just to keep it brief, I guess the rights bit of it. So I listen and all to Grainia with her experience of this, and I listen and learn. From an equalities perspective, I did have 20 odd years in Leicester, where equalities was very much at the core of our work, based on the various kind of ethnic minority communities and new communities that were in the city. So I would say I was vested in the principles and understanding of that, the practice of that. There are differences here, and I continue to learn on a daily basis. But I guess I would underwrite my kind of holistic approach to city development and equalities perspective, and then as has been commented on, the rights part of that, I'm still learning.
Great, thank you so much, Alistair and Grainia. I'm now going to hand over to Hugh Ellis, who's the Policy Director of the Town and Country Planning Association, and is part of the Take Back the City Coalition. And his responsibilities at the TCPA include leading on policy development and briefings and engagements with central government. And he is also, since 2015, he's co-authored 4 books. He's been a long involvement in terms of planning around land tax and climate. Prior to joining the TCPA, he was National Planning Advisor to Friends of the Earth England, and he's going to speak today to bring expertise in planning on the conversations around the site and around what we're working on. So I'm going to hand over to you now to bring it to a close.
Thanks, Rory. I hope everyone can hear me. And you know what? I'm going to try and do this in 2 minutes. Is that okay? So I'm going to rip up the presentation. I'm going to...
No. Take your time. No, it's okay. We have a couple of minutes.
We'll do it in 3. We'll do it in 3.
Yeah.
But you know what a fantastic event to be involved in. And I'm going to take it that we're all agreed that this site has huge potential for community-led social housing. That's what I'm hearing. You know, there's no technical barriers here. Actually, there's political issues. And if you want to know about the TCPA, I won't do the introduction, but we're kind of for 125 years, we've been in the hope business. And I think our conclusion after 125 years is that what we need is development models that meet people's needs, not the other way around. And for far too often in cities and communities, we've been applying a development model, which is basically an extractive industry, doesn't meet human needs, and then interestingly creates not just the conditions which don't deliver the good life, but also costs to the public purse in terms of social care and ongoing costs to the NHS. So the TCPA has been involved with the NHS, it's been involved in trying to construct healthy places, and I suppose I just want to say very quickly that there's no technical barrier. That's what we've heard from this event. That's, I think, what we can really bring to the table. There's no technical barrier to a zero carbon house. There's no technical barrier to an accessible home. There's no technical barrier to building places, buildings and wider communities that meet human needs. And across the world, and certainly across Western Europe, you know, that's being done and being done very powerfully. And I think we're right to conclude that we've fallen very badly behind. So in shorthand, you know, the rest of Northwest Europe's building Teslas in terms of houses, and we're still building Mark II Ford Escorts. You know, the transformation is there. And then quickly to say, look, change is desirable. Change is going to make everything about people's lives better, people's mental and physical health and their life chances better if they have access to decent homes in communities that allow them to thrive. But change is a necessity, is it not? We're going to have to re-engineer Belfast for climate change. And, you know, the science is frightening. The science of our health crisis going forward, demographic change, all these issues require that level of change. But it's okay to be visionary, and I will be quick. It is okay to be visionary, but I think the thing about the Mackie's site is it's also interesting that we've got rich technical solutions. We've also got rich development models that we can apply to it. Almost the last thing you would do is put your city in the hands of an unfettered private sector. And I would say, just speaking from London, that the disaster of planning reform in England has led for the first time, for example, to the conversion of time-expired office blocks into private rented housing for some of our most vulnerable people. Some of that doesn't have windows, kids are playing in car parks, it is slum housing. And that's what happens when you separate the planning process from people and their needs, and you separate them from communities and their voice. So I think on the Mackie's site, there's an opportunity, isn't there, to really be at the front edge of this debate by putting those powerful needs that we've heard about right in the driving seat. And okay, so the TCPA is talking to you from London and from Westminster, which last time I checked hasn't had a good idea for about 30 years. And we're not underestimating the barriers that we all face. But I was really struck in this morning's session by the determination of people. Isn't that a common theme? You know, the talent there is on the ground and the determination of communities to make a difference and make it work. And I'm inspired by that determination. And I think what that means in terms of TCPA's role is that we're not here to impose. We are here to help in any way we can. And I think I want to make a general offer to both departments and ministers, to the City Council, Housing Executive. You know, we're not got an axe to grind here, apart from the fact that we honestly believe that this is a really important opportunity to demonstrate a different approach. So the question is, isn't it, how can we bring this conversation together? I want to leave you with just two final thoughts. I don't know whether it's me having done 30 years of planning and being pretty old and pretty burnt out, but I don't know how well you feel, but I think we need to crack on, don't we? I honestly get this sense of time running out for people, particularly post-pandemic, and particularly in communities where a whole generation is being brought up really without hope. And so we've got to find practical hope. Not interested in, you know, excuse my language, kind of bullshit visions. I'm interested in how we can actually do this. And the legacy and the history and the record from across the world is that we can do this. So I'll leave you with this thought, really, having been inspired by today, having been inspired by this project, standing ready to have the conversation with whoever wants to talk, and being absolutely determined that we're not going away as an organisation. So we've got the conference, we've got the special issue of our journal, which will feature this project coming out in the autumn. So it's, you know, it's a great project and there's a lot happening. But you can dismiss hope as kind of the idea of the despairing, can't you? You can say that people cling to hope when they've got nothing else. But I actually think in 125 years, that hope and that aspiration is the basis of all progress. you've got to want difference first, haven't you? You've got to want the change. Yes, it will be difficult. I'm sure there'll be problems along the way, but the TCPA is not going away. So we really want to support this initiative. We wish you well, and I'm sure we'll be building this autumn. Well, we're not. I'll leave it there, Rory, because I know you're short of time.
Hugh, thank you so much for that, and really excellent summation. And I think the idea of hope is absolutely central. And you know, all of us engaged in this are involved because we do hope, and we're hopeful, and we believe that this is possible. And I think that is the foundation of it, because we know it's necessary. It is absolutely necessary to develop to address the housing needs, the housing rights, but also the sustainability crisis and the creation of sustainable, inclusive communities that offer a hopeful future for Belfast and beyond as well. And so really, to end, I'd like to extend the invitation to all of you here today, and to those of you who watch this back or who find out about it, that we want you to be part of this journey, the conversation, the plan of action with Take Back the City, that we're going to be taking forward into the future. If you are interested in being part of it, you can sign up online. Obviously, we will be reaching out to engage with individuals, organizations, and the public sector. And there's going to be a survey put up online after the event, after you leave the event. We'd love you to sign up on that, and will be in touch with you about ideas to explore and how you can get involved. And finally, just like to thank everyone for attending, for being part of this, what I believe is a historic event, and will be and is the foundation for a new, better future. And the status quo is certainly not an option. So we look forward to working with you all into the coming weeks and months and years. Take care.